Welcome back to the D6 Family Ministry podcast. We believe that discipleship should not be difficult, so we're here to help you connect the dots between church and home. Together, let's guide each generation, whether related to you or not, to stand confident in their faith. I'm your host, Ron Hunter, and with me as always is my co-host, Marianne Howard. Welcome back.
Welcome back, and today we are covering a topic, or Jonathan Williams is covering a topic that we are super passionate about, and it's dismantling silos within age-graded ministries within our church. And so I've got a fun question for you that might stump you, but I'm curious to hear your answer. If you could go back in time, Ron, and witness one key moment in church history related to family ministry, where would you go and why?
Witness church history related to family ministry. Wow. My mind is racing through many moments, and here's where it's landed. In the Old Testament, there's a conversation between Abraham and Sarah when they were not able to have kids, and yet God had promised an heir. And Sarah offers up her handmaid to Abraham. I want to press pause in that moment, and I would love to get in Abraham's head and see what he's thinking versus what words are coming out of his mouth that we have in Scripture. I want to do the same with Sarah, because that moment in family ministry, when they run ahead to make a decision that is ungodly under the pretense of following God, has totally erupted into everything that we see wrong with the Middle East today. We would not have seen the last 2 years between Israel and Gaza occur had this moment in time not occurred. I would love to see that one. What a question, Marianne. I know,
and in light of that answer, I mean, the decisions we make today shape trajectory. And so I would just like to encourage our listeners, I would like for you to consider, as you listen to this short clip, think about the specific age group that you work with in your church, and how are you being intentional to make sure that that specific age group is connecting with other age groups in your church. Give this clip a listen.
I think there's just a call now to get rid of not those ministries, but to get rid of that siloed approach and then to unify those ministries.
Well, listeners, I want to encourage you and let you know that you are in for a treat, and you're about to hear a master class on family ministry.
Well said.
And generational discipleship. This guy has, it's just so wise. I had to pause this interview multiple times and write some things down, because he just maps out just such insightful strategies for being a generational discipleship-oriented church. And so here's the thing I'd like for you to consider as you listen to this episode is, how can your church balance age-specific discipleship while simultaneously fostering generational engagement? Let's give this a listen.
Do you find it difficult to have meaningful conversations about God with those you want to disciple? If you feel like this, you're not alone. And there is good news. Discipleship doesn't have to be difficult. The most effective discipleship happens when you simply talk about God in the everyday moments of life. With the D6 Everyday Foundations curriculum, you can simplify discipleship by making these conversations easy. Because of our generational aligned curriculum, all ages, from preschoolers to grandparents and everyone in between, learn from the same scriptures each week. This means you can have those easy conversations around the table, in the car, or anytime, because what you're learning, they're learning too. Discipleship doesn't have to be difficult. Visit d6family.com to learn more and use the link in the description.
Today, I am joined by Dr. Jonathan Williams. Dr. Williams is the Executive Director of Gospel Family Ministries and the author of A Practical Theology of Family Worship and Gospel Family. He teaches as an adjunct professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he's the managing editor of the Southwestern D6 Family Ministry Journal. Dr. Williams, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, David, thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Well, we're talking about a topic that I think has hit a lot of churches, and a lot of churches have dealt with, probably especially if you jump back to the 90s to now, right, and what we're dealing with. And that's the topic of eradicating silos and creating a unified family vision of family ministry. Now, when we discuss family ministry, we use those terms like silo, and we use terms like silo ministry quite often. But I think there's probably a group of people out there that still have not heard that. They're not familiar with that. So can you kind of explain what silos are as it relates to ministry?
Yeah, I think, Timothy Paul Jones wrote that toward the end of the 20th century, many of our churches, and with great intentions to reach the next generation, what we had done, though, unintentionally, we had kind of segmented the family, segmented ministry. So you had preschool ministry over here doing their own thing, children's ministry doing their own thing, youth ministry over there doing their own thing. And I'm a big fan of youth ministry, children's ministry, preschool ministry, but this segmented approach is what kind of made us take a step back and say, maybe there's a better way to approach this. Maybe there's a better way to do family ministry. But that siloed approach, the silos, holding grains, different types of grains on a farm. And that's kind of how we were treating different types of ministry in the church, completely separated. And so I think there's just a call now to get rid of not those ministries, but to get rid of that siloed approach and then to unify those ministries.
How did that start? Where did we get to the point where we started doing that? Because I just looking back through church history, that hasn't always been there. I think if you went back 100 years, the idea of youth ministry wouldn't necessarily even exist. So kind of how did that begin where we started segmenting things?
Yeah, the idea of discipling people by age, that's existed throughout church history. Like Luther used to meet with the children on Sunday afternoon and do catechisms. In the 1600s, Richard Baxter, Puritan pastor, the youth would meet on Saturday nights. They didn't call it youth, as adolescents, and they would do Bible study and worship and prayer. So discipleship by age, I think, has existed for a long time. But yeah, the early 1900s with the efficiency movement, all of a sudden churches kind of bought into this idea that we need to bring in professionals to specialize in certain ministries. Meanwhile, in the American culture, from the Industrial Revolution to schools becoming mandatory to men working outside the home, we kind of created by the 1950s, 1960s, the teenager. For the first time ever, there was this generation that all they really had to do was go to school. And yet somehow they still had money, and that money could affect the market. And so it was around that time in the 1940s, 1950s that parachurch ministries started reaching out to youth for Christ, Young Life, and churches soon followed. But again, I love the idea of discipling youth intentionally, and I think that's what Jones meant by we had great heart, we had great intentions in order to do this, but then through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, this movement just came more and more segmented. It wasn't the church is reaching youth. It was we hired a youth pastor, you go reach the youth. It wasn't the church is discipling children. It's we hired a children's minister, you go take care of the kids. And parents more and more abdicated their role as the primary disciple makers to the staff professionals. And so I think we kind of had our eyes open toward the end of the 1900s, early 2000s. In the 1900s, in the Southern Baptist Convention, they were baptizing something like 90,000 youth a year. That's a lot, but by the early 2000s, we started seeing a few things. Christian Smith wrote his book, Soul Searching, and he was basically trying to identify the type of faith that those young people had. And he said those young people, a lot of their faith could be best characterized as moral therapeutic deism. Then we started hearing this research that, maybe 65% of those youth are leaving the church when they turn 18. And so those were some of the things that kind of woke us up to that fact of we've segmented it, we siloed it, we've neglected the parents, and there needs to be a change.
Well, you mentioned youth ministry, children's ministry, and when those silos are there, they can be extremely evident. We can just kind of look at our programming and say, yeah, it exists. Other times, silos aren't necessarily as easy to notice. What are some signs that silo ministries may exist in our church, even beyond youth ministry and children's ministry?
Yeah, I think one of the things is to look at the different generations. There's a difference between a multi-generational church and an intergenerational church. And the multi-generational church, the generations that are there, you have boomers, Gen X, millennials, the Zoomers, Gen Alpha, but there's no real community between the groups. In an intergenerational church, you have kind of shared life between the. So I think one of the signs of the silos is that the generations aren't sharing life together. In fact, a lot of times there's competition between generations, competing over space or music. Another sign of siloed ministries is competition between ministries. And that exists a lot. I pastored a church for 10 years and served before that as a church planter, before that as a youth pastor. So I've been on lots of church staffs, and I know that sometimes ministers, they compete for volunteers, they compete for budget, they compete for space. And I think that's a sign that maybe we're not doing things together, we're doing things separately. So that's another sign. Another sign that siloed ministries exist is, one, staff members only attend their own events. So if you have a missions pastor who's never around the youth, then it's unlikely you're going to have a generation of youth passionate about missions. If you have a youth pastor who's never around the children, well, those children in a year or two are going to be in your youth group. And to miss out on building those relationships would be a mistake, I think. So when they only kind of stay in their own world, that's a sign. And in the same vein, siloed ministries probably exist if no one in the church knows anything about the ministry unless they're in it. So I always like to challenge youth pastors, go ask senior adults in your church, what do they know about the youth? Who do they know in the youth group? And if they don't know what's going on in the youth group, then something needs to change. The church needs to be more involved in each other's lives and ministries.
That's really good. Well, it can be very easy for us to criticize the church for doing things the way they've always been done. But we know that change is going to be hard no matter who you are, no matter where you are. Why is it so difficult for churches to eliminate this silo mentality?
It's challenging because it takes a lot more work and a lot more time, a lot more intentionality. So for example, if you're a youth minister, to eliminate the siloed approach, you need to start working with the preschool and children's minister. You need to start allowing your teaching to be unified. What are we teaching in preschool, and how do we build on that in elementary? How do we build on that in middle school and high school? And so that takes time. That takes that team meeting together regularly. It also takes some humility. We have to invite one another in. Instead of me just getting to be in my world and making all my decisions, I have to serve with the whole team. And let's make these decisions together. So I think that's part of the challenge. It takes time. It takes intentionality. It takes some humility. It takes a youth pastor also saying, with all of my demands, you're asking me to disciple these 30 youth, 50 youth, whatever it is. Now you're telling me if I'm going to really get rid of the silos, I got to bring the parents in. So now I got to find time, make time to spend time with these parents, to disciple them, to equip them so they can disciple their youth. So it's hard work, but the fruit is worth it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about some practical steps that we can take to start eliminating these silos and start moving towards unified family ministry. We'll be right back.
Do you imagine a church brimming with engaged members, where discipleship flourishes and your mission profoundly impacts lives? Well, this can be more than an imagination. It can be reality when you read Brad Ransom's book, Creating Healthy Church Systems. This transformative resource will help you with the knowledge and skills to build the systems that are unique to your church's situation. You will be able to assess the health of your congregation and build comprehensive blueprints for the essential systems that form the foundation of a healthy church. This book offers not just theory, but it's also a very practical guide on implementing these systems. It's time for us to transform our churches. Grab this book, Creating Healthy Church Systems by Brad Ransom. To purchase or learn more, visit d6.family/store or click the link in the description below.
We're back, and we're talking to Dr. Jonathan Williams, and we're talking about how to eradicate silos and create a unified vision for family ministry. Just to talk some nuts and bolts here, what are some practical steps that churches can take to begin eradicating these silos and really start creating that unified family vision?
Yeah, I think even by calling it a family ministry vision, we're already taking the first step. Because instead of viewing things as preschool ministry, children's ministry, youth ministry, to have this kind of umbrella term, family ministry. As a church, we are ministering to families. We're passing the baton of faith to the next generation. We're equipping parents to disciple their kids, all these kind of hallmarks of family ministry. So one of the first steps after we start using that phrase is to identify who is our family ministry team. And that's not just staff members, that's some parents, that's some key volunteers, and then to get to where that team meets regularly. Now, some of it, if it is staff members, they might meet every week. I used to do a staff meeting with my full staff, and then I'd have another meeting where I'd meet with my family ministry team. And so you might say the family ministry staff meets once a week, but then once a quarter, we meet with our key volunteers, our key parents as well. So identifying the team, meeting regularly, and when you meet, one of the main things you want to do is actually cast a vision for family ministry. Everybody needs to be on the same page. Most churches right now, if we were to ask 100 members, what's y'all's vision for reaching families? What's your vision for discipling the next generation? What's your vision for equipping parents? We'd get a lot of different answers. And what we want to do is get to where there's one answer, one vision, and that needs to be underneath the mission statement of the whole church. So each church that is going to look a little bit different. It's going to flesh it out in some unique ways. But you got the team, you got the vision, you're meeting regularly. Another practical thing to do is to find ways to unify our teaching ministry. When I was pastoring, at one point I wrote down every Bible study we had that week, every devotion, men's devotion, women's devotions, everything going on in the small groups. And I figured out that if you had a family of 5, mom and dad with a preschool, elementary age, and a youth age kid, if they came to everything we offered that week, they would go to 13 different Bible studies in 1 week, none of which were related from the teaching standpoint. And to me, that just didn't seem really healthy. I didn't feel like we were doing the families a lot of favors. I think a lot of times parents tell me they don't disciple their kids because they feel ill-equipped. Well, one of the ways to make them feel more equipped and to equip them is to teach them things that we're also teaching the kids, and kind of gives them a head start in those faith conversations at home. So I think finding ways to unify the teaching ministry. So we actually, when we made that shift, we switched over to the D6 curriculum, because D6 curriculum allowed us to teach similar things from babies all the way to senior adults. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to teach the same thing. It might mean that your teaching builds on one another. But unifying the teaching ministry is huge. Finding ways to celebrate family ministry during the worship services. That's a great time to share testimonies so your senior adults do know what's going on in the youth. Establishing Titus 2 relationships is a big part, right? Getting older adults, discipling younger adults. I believe that every member of the church should have an answer to the question, who are you passing your faith down to? Every Christian, if there's a junior in high school who's a Christian, he should have an answer to that question, right? Everybody should be living out that Psalm 78 passion of passing faith down to the next generation so they set their hope in God.
That's really good. Well, when we talk about family ministry, one of the fears I often hear from people is that they're worried that this will completely eliminate ministries that they love. People say, well, our kids are going to be bored being in the service with everybody else, or we can't have our senior ministry. Do those things really have to go away, or is it just a matter of how we're actually looking at it and going about the philosophy?
Yeah, no, I don't think those things have to go away at all. In fact, I think it will preserve them longer if we make these changes. Because one of the dangers of continuing in the siloed, segmented approach is burnout from all your leaders. When you're on an island doing everything on your own, by yourself, at some point, that you burn out. So we're losing staff members, we're losing volunteers right now. I mean, the average length of a youth pastor, senior pastor is decreasing every single year. So I think by unifying these, building a strong team, having a clear vision, I think it actually ensures that you have a team leading faithfully longer. So it makes it healthier when you do that. So you don't have to get rid of things. And at the end of the day, the number one danger, I believe, into continuing in these segmented approaches is that we will lose the next generation. And that's what we're seeing right now. All the research tells us we're on a trajectory to Judges 2:10, where a generation arose that did not know the Lord. Now, I believe that God can turn the tide, bring revival, and I think doing things like this, creating that unified family ministry vision, intergenerational discipleship, Titus 2 ministry, equipping parents to disciple their kids, those are the kinds of things I think God will use to reach that next generation.
Well, we know that this is going to take a total church effort.
Yeah.
This can't just be a few people hoping to get this done. Really, the church has to be on board with this idea. How can we cast a vision that will get the church excited about this and on board, and also help them realize they're really not losing something, they're gaining something?
Yeah, I think one, we need to be honest about the situation we're in our nation. And it's not to create fear, but it is to bring about a sense of urgency. And again, the situation we're in right now is that if nothing changes, 30, 40 years from now, we will have lost that next generation. That generation Alpha, we're losing them. One author says in 3 generations, we've gone from a committed generation to a compromised generation to now a very confused generation. And so I think we need to kind of sound the alarm a little bit in the church. Again, not to create fear or panic, but to create urgency. And then the number one thing that's going to motivate the church, of course, is God's word. And I don't just say that as a cliche. If this is just a model or some pastor's idea, people aren't going to get that excited. But when they see this is biblical, we preach and teach texts like Psalm 78, and we challenge the church to leave a legacy of faith that will outlive and outlast them. So it's not about, serving myself, meeting my needs right now. It's what can I do to make sure that 30 years from now, there's still a vibrant, healthy church in this place. And I think when we cast that kind of Psalm 78 legacy of faith, pass the baton down to the next generation vision, people do get excited. I've seen it. I've seen times where we go through Psalm 78 and the church is fired up to be a part of this vision.
Well, I appreciate what you shared today. It's a topic that I think can be a little uncomfortable for people, but the way that you have put this, I think, is going to put people more at ease because it can feel like we're losing something and losing something we love, but it doesn't have to. It can be that we're actually gaining something even bigger. So I appreciate you sharing this and for what you're doing. I think you've really given us a great path for how we can implement this. Thank you so much.
David, thank you so much, brother.
Marianne, you said it well, masterclass. Jonathan is a professor at Southwestern Seminary, and you understand why he is in the role he's in. He comes at it from a pastor's heart, a professor's insight, and he puts on the hat of spouse and father and weaves them brilliantly together to give us these insights. I want to really ask our listeners to go back to the question you asked prior to the interview. How are you being intentional to connect the age you work with the most to generations older and to generations younger, weaving together the beauty of iron sharpening iron among all generations?
Yes, and can I just encourage staff members, pastors, children's ministry leaders, this is an episode to listen to as a staff, and this would be a good staff meeting, dialogue, dreaming. Just evaluate some of the things that were brought up in this episode as a staff and see where you can make some adjustments to get generational engagement across every corner, every wall in your church. We're excited. Thank you so much for listening today. We hope you'll join us next week where we're going to hear from our friend Becky Sparks, who is going to bring up and talk about boundaries in family, and you're not going to want to miss it. If you'd like to learn more, visit d6family.com. We look forward to seeing you next week.